This is Big Tasty Sports.
Welcome to some more Futures Talk on Big Tasty Sports. Going to do something a little bit different today than what we've done in the past. Going to be looking at lines for individual games as we progress toward the season. Those are out on DraftKings now. I looked around and I didn't see much beyond week one anywhere else, but DraftKings has them out through the whole season. So we are going to hit, starting with week 3, some spots that I think are worth paying attention to. I will talk to you about why I think they're worth paying attention to, and then you can make your judgments from there. I am not going to bet. I don't think I'm going to bet everything that I talk about on the show today. This is going to be spots that stuck out to me. I actually had more than this written down, went back through and tried to identify the ones if I had to pick some over others. However, if you want to know the ones that I am betting, you can subscribe at bigtastysports.substack.com. You can subscribe for free. You can subscribe for a very low price, $7 a month, less than that if you do a whole year. That is where I'm going to be sharing the specific bets that I do make on some of these lines. So the ones that I like best. But again, I'm going to talk through them. You might pick up on things you like or don't like. I'm going to talk through everything that I have. So I'm not keeping certain games back. Just that is where I will share the ones that I for sure am betting. Who knows? Maybe you'll be able to tell by the way I talk about them. Hard to say. You can follow on Twitter at Big Tasty Sports. Pretty much everything gets posted there as well. So if you aren't following yet, please do that. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel. Going to continue having more stuff coming out as we move toward the NFL season. A lot of it focused around futures, but there will be things as we get closer like this that are focused on individual games. 2 things before we jump in. Number one is if you're watching the video, I'm not that sorry, but I apologize ahead of time. You'll probably see me looking to the side sometimes. That's because I have my schedule pulled up on my other screen, and there are going to be times where I want to check that to be able to talk about certain games that I'm discussing. The other thing is a couple considerations as we just kind of big picture as we get into specific weeks and specific games. What we're really trying to do here is identify places where the line is likely to be different by the time we actually get to a game than it is right now. And there are a number of different factors that can play into that. I do have 1 or 2 spots that I'm going to talk about where I just think the line is off. Even though looking at schedule and other things, I'm not sure that it'll be substantially different. Well, not sure. Obviously, I'm not a fortune teller. I don't know for sure that any of them will be different. But there are quite a few where I think there's a high likelihood that they're different by the time we get there. And that has to do with scheduling. It has to do with record at the time that a game is played. It has to do with certain teams being overvalued and other teams being undervalued. So that is big picture. What we're trying to do, though, is identify places where the line will be different. And if that's the case and you bet one side now, it gives you an opportunity to middle/hedge out if you want to. Or it just gets you a better line. I don't tend to be a CLV bro, but it's pretty hard to dispute the fact that if you end up with a better line than where the game goes off, that's a good thing. I don't know really how you would dispute that. Feel free if you'd like. All right, with that said, we're going to start in week 3 is where we pick it up. I think giving a couple weeks of space for things to play out a little bit is going to help on changing some of these lines. So in week 3, I have 2 games that I'm looking at. The first one is Atlanta +5 at Detroit. Atlanta's going to be coming off of 2 winnable home games, Carolina and Green Bay. Carolina and Green Bay are both teams. Man, I've been so low on Green Bay, and I'm starting to question that a little bit. But who knows how much of it is propaganda coming out of Green Bay about Jordan Love being pretty good. We'll see if that ends up playing out and being the case. But regardless, I think those are both teams that could take a little bit of time to get going just because of the youth of their team. Now, Green Bay does have a little bit more established defense. And, Aaron Jones, they've got a couple veteran skill players as well. So Green Bay, I think, will be a harder game at the beginning of the year than Carolina. But I think those are both winnable. Detroit has to go to Kansas City to open the season, and then they have Seattle at home. I think it's a pretty tall task for them to go into Kansas City and win on opening night. In fact, if anything, I think there's a chance they could get blown out there with Kansas City coming in dialed in for that first game. And then Seattle at home, that's a long trip for Seattle, and that's something that's going to be a theme as we go through this. But Seattle should be a good team, so I don't think that game is a gimme. So I think it's likely that Detroit is either 1-1 or 0-2, and Atlanta, I definitely think, can be 2-0. If that's the case, I think it swings this line a little bit to Detroit minus 3.5, -3. Maybe we even see a 2.5 at best if things play out that way. And right now you can get Atlanta +5. So that makes sense to me as a line that would be worth grabbing now. The other one is Philadelphia -6.5 at Tampa Bay. This is a game that's on the road, and so you always want to be a little bit careful of that. And we don't know for sure who's playing quarterback for Tampa Bay. But Philly and San Francisco, at least from the looks of things right now, should be at the top of the NFC again, and I think Tampa Bay will be near the bottom of the NFC. So getting less than a touchdown in points for Philadelphia against a team like Tampa Bay is something that I think is worth considering. Also, Philly's coming off a mini bye. They play Minnesota at home on a Thursday night, and this game is on a Monday, so they get extra rest coming into this one, and that's something that can always benefit a team. So for week 3, Atlanta +5 and Philly -6.5 are two bets that I think are worth considering. We move on to week 4. Here I just have one, and this is Indy is +1 at home versus the Rams. At this point, let me look over at the actual games. The Rams are at Seattle, San Francisco at home, at Cincinnati on a Monday night. I think even though the Rams may have their full complement of players at the beginning of the year, and that's probably when they're at their most dangerous, this could definitely be a team that's 0-3 at that point. Where Indy, I don't expect them to be great. They have Jacksonville at home. They go to Houston, and then they're at Baltimore. This definitely could be 0-3 for them as well, but I think they could get Houston early on in the season, so maybe 1-2. So I think the narrative maybe starts to build on the Rams not being very well. I mean, that narrative's already there, and I don't think the Rams are going to be very good. But like I said, I think they're going to be at their most dangerous early on in the season. But if they go 0-3, I think it could start to build of, man, is this team in full rebuild mode? Are they going to be able to beat anyone? And at that point, I don't see the Rams being the favorite in this game. I think it could stay close to a pick 'em, or maybe Indianapolis ends up being -1.5 or something like that. But at +1 right now, I think there's decent value there on Indianapolis against the Rams in week 4. We move on. That's the only one for week 4 that I've got. So we move on to week 5. And here again, Indianapolis is -1 against Tennessee at home. I think Tennessee could be 0-4 at this point. Let me go to that. And they are at New Orleans. I'm not super high on New Orleans. We'll see. Then they have to go to the Chargers. That's tough to go all the way out to Los Angeles. They're at Cleveland, and then they have Cincinnati at home. Other than New Orleans, I'm pretty confident those other 3 teams are going to be better than Tennessee this year. So they could be 0-4. Maybe they're 1-3. Already talked about Indianapolis, and not saying they're going to be setting the world on fire, but if they can beat the Rams the week before and get to 500 there at 2-2, then I think this line opens up further, probably is -2.5, or maybe even gets to -3. And so Indianapolis -1 against Tennessee in week 5 seems like a reasonable spot to me. The other one, and you're going to see some themes here because there are certain teams that I think from my perspective, the market seems to be undervaluing or overvaluing. So you're going to hear some similar teams multiple times, as you just did with Indianapolis. Another team that pops up again here for me is Atlanta -3 against Houston at home. Here again, Houston starts with a pretty tough schedule. They're at Baltimore. Then they play Indianapolis. That's the game at home that could be winnable for them. But if they don't get that, then they're at Jacksonville and they play Pittsburgh. So they reasonably could be 0-4. The other thing about Houston to me is this is a young team. It's a new head coach. And so I like Houston to build as the season goes along and to be a better team half or 2/3 of the way through the season than they are at the beginning. I think at the beginning is when they're likely to be at their weakest. And I think Atlanta should be a solid NFC team this year, which isn't saying a lot, but I think they're going to be decent. And I think they could have a pretty dynamic offense. So with home field, this is saying it depends how many points you give for home field. People will give anywhere between 1 and 2, or maybe even 2.5. But Atlanta -3, you're saying it's somewhat close to a pick 'em. And I don't think at this point in the season that's the case between these two teams. And you love to get lines like this before it would move to a 3.5. I mean, so even if the line move for this game only goes from 3 to 3.5, there's value getting the -3. So that is week 5. Atlanta -3, Indianapolis -1 are two lines that I think are worth considering. We move on to week 6, just one game here. This one I'm flipping around the other way. Well, no, I'm not flipping around the other way yet, but it's Houston again. But this time it's New Orleans -3 at Houston. New Orleans is not a team that I'm incredibly high on, though I understand that they have significant upside if they can reach their potential. So it's not that I love New Orleans, but Houston has such a tough schedule. If they lose to Atlanta, if they lose to Indianapolis, they could be 0-5 here. And so if that's the case, I think this definitely moves over 3 and gets to 3.5, even 4 or 4.5 by the time we get there. So to me, this isn't necessarily like, oh my gosh, I love New Orleans in this spot so much as it is. I think that the line will be wider by the time we get to the week of this game than it is right now. And that would give me the chance to middle or hedge depending on what I see from those teams early on. So that's my only one in week 6. Week 7, I got a couple games to pay attention to. The first one is Baltimore -3 at home against Detroit. And this one goes to how I view these two teams. So let me just very briefly talk through that. Because once again, depending on how much you give for home field advantage, this is saying that this is somewhere between a pick'em and Baltimore -1.5 on a neutral field. I think that Baltimore has significantly upgraded their offense. I think they have the opportunity to be incredibly dynamic on offense this year and score a lot of points. Their defense is actually going to be the question mark, but I think that if they can increase their pressure rate from what was a pretty dismal showing for Baltimore last year, I think that this can once again at least be an average defense, and that could be good enough. Detroit also could have a very dynamic offense. That's certainly in the cards. They showed a lot of that last year. But we're talking about one of the better teams in the AFC. I'm not saying the very top, but an upper third AFC team versus maybe an upper third NFC team, and those two things are very different. I think the Lions are likely to be inconsistent, and I don't think that their talent level is quite going to be there with Baltimore yet. So this game it would be different if this was in Detroit, but being in Baltimore, again, we're not getting up to that 3.5, and I think again that's what could happen is this game gets to 3.5, and so the 3 ends up being a good value. And then the other one, and this is going to start being a little bit of a theme, but is Seattle -7 against Arizona at home. Now, by week 7, Kyler Murray could be back, and that makes me a little bit hesitant on this because I think it certainly helps to have him in there playing. But Arizona just got rid of DeAndre Hopkins. I almost think you could look at betting against Arizona almost any week. Seattle's tough at home, and Seattle, I think, could be a very solid team. Talked about that in other places. So, I mean, you're giving up the touchdown. These lines where it's 3, 7 are worth paying attention to because when those move half a point, you lose some real value. Especially if it moves 1.5 and gets to 8.5, then you do even more. And so I have some interest in Seattle -7 at home against Arizona and Baltimore -3 at home versus Detroit in week 7. Moving on to week 8. Go back to the well with Seattle. Cleveland comes to Seattle, and Seattle is only -1.5. Now, I think Cleveland could be a decent team this year. I have increasingly started to think more highly of them. I like that they added Zadarius Smith. Their defense should be tough. A lot falls on how Deshaun Watson plays. And we just don't know what that's going to look like. But they certainly have some weapons, and Amari Cooper and Nick Chubb leading the way there. But Seattle's just tough at home, and they're a good team. And I think 1.5 is low. Again, I think this game gets to 2.5 or even 3 by the time we get to the game. And then I have back to Baltimore as well, -5.5 at Arizona. I just think by this time in the season, any good team is probably going to be favored over Arizona by about 7 or more. And Baltimore should be a very good team. So, again, getting a 1.5 under that 7, I don't know that we're going to see that again once we get to the game. Week 9, Pittsburgh -4 versus Tennessee. This game is on a Thursday in Pittsburgh. That is something that I haven't talked about much because I still want to find the right spots. It's not like automatically the road team is going to lose a Thursday night game. That's not the case, but it is kind of significant. So it's a really short week for both teams, but Tennessee is the one that has to travel into a hostile environment. Also, Tennessee could have a very bad record by this time. Going back to Tennessee, we talked about them earlier, but even if they would beat Indianapolis, even if they beat New Orleans, they have their bye, and then they have Atlanta at home. Let's say they can win 2 of those games. They're 2-4 at that point. Where Pittsburgh, on the other hand, they have a tough schedule, so they come out of the gates with some tough games, but they do play at the Raiders. They have Houston at home. They have their bye, and then they play, let's see, am I looking at that right? At the Rams, and then they have Jacksonville at home. So this is a team that maybe, like 4-3, let's say. But 4-3 versus 2-4 is still a significant discrepancy. And I think that with the short week combined with those records, we definitely could see this line move out to 4.5, 5.5, maybe even 6, depending on how good Pittsburgh has looked. This is a team that I do kind of like this year. And so that's another one that I like. I'm going to run through a few others that I like this week. I actually had 4 for this week. I don't want to spend too much time on every single game here. So Green Bay -2.5 against the Rams. Again, I think the Rams season is probably over by this point, and this game is in Green Bay. And Green Bay, I think, gets better as the season goes on. So by week 9, we may be seeing a lot of improvement there, and so that would make -2.5 a very good line. Houston -1 with at home against Tampa Bay. This would say that on a neutral field, Tampa Bay should be slightly favored. I think Houston, with DeMeco Ryans at the helm, improves as the season goes along. And by week 9, I think this team is growing into who they can be, where I think Tampa Bay is probably heading the other direction with a bunch of veteran players who are no longer going to be reasonably in playoff contention. And so I could see them moving the other direction. So to get Houston only -1 at home seems like a valuable spot. And then Baltimore -3 at home against Seattle is another spot to look at. Again, just a very long trip for Seattle. And I would give Baltimore the slight edge in terms of which team would be better. And this says it's close to even on a neutral field. Maybe Baltimore slightly favored. So, and it goes back to that thing again that I've said many times, getting lines that are at 3 or 7 now, if you think there's a chance they move off of that 3 or 7, is something to consider. So that takes care of week 9. By the way, we're not going all the way through week 18 because it just gets iffier as you get near the end of the season. You don't know which teams are totally out of contention. So we are going to go through week 14, and we're on week 10 right now. Got 2 games to consider here. The first is Pittsburgh -3 at home against Green Bay. Pittsburgh is coming off a mini bye. As we talked about, they play Tennessee at home on Thursday night. So they get a few extra games. They probably could have that too. A few extra days here to prepare for Green Bay. Green Bay home against the Rams. So it's a regular week for Green Bay, but having to travel to Pittsburgh. Again, I think Pittsburgh is just going to be a significantly better team than Green Bay is this year, even though I think Green Bay has the chance to improve some as the season goes along. So being at 3, I easily see this getting to 3.5. If I had to guess what this line will be by the time we get to the game, I would say either 3.5 or 4.5. So at 3, I like that. And then the other one is Seattle -3.5 at home against Washington. I think it could be a tough year for Washington. We'll see how their defense can perform. I don't believe in Sam Howell, and I think that he's going to struggle with turnovers and efficiency. Maybe he proves me wrong, and if he does, Washington could be a decent team. But again, with them going to Seattle, And it's at 3.5, not 3. So maybe you love that a little bit less, but this just feels like something that could get pretty wide if Washington's season goes south and Seattle's in contention like we think they could be, where it gets up even into that 6.5 kind of range. But that's projecting how these teams will do, which is kind of the exercise that we're doing right now. All right. If you've come along this far, you get the treat of the last 4 weeks we're going to cover. We'll see if it's a treat or not. Week 11, Seattle -1.5 at the Rams. Okay, by this point in the season, what are the chances Matthew Stafford is not hurt? What are the chances Aaron Donald is not either hurt or like, screw this, I'm not playing anymore? Or how many of these guys get traded? The Rams have traded away so many of their draft picks in order to put together this veteran-laden team that now has fallen apart. They need to try to rebuild the future. So I wouldn't be shocked to see them be sellers in the trade market. Cooper Kupp, Aaron Donald. I mean, that's basically the value pieces they have. If that happens, this is going to be one of the worst teams in the league. And right now, Seattle's only favored by 1.5 points. I know that it's in LA, it's not in Seattle, but Seattle should be a good team this year. And by this point, I really don't think the Rams are. If the Rams have sold off pieces, this line is definitely over 3. So 1.5 seems well worth considering to me. That's only one for week 11. Week 12, it gets a little more sparse here. Week 12, I only have one as well to consider, and that is Indianapolis -1 at home against Tampa Bay. We've kind of covered this already, but just a couple extra pieces here. I think these are teams likely headed in different directions by this time in the season. And Indianapolis is coming off a bye, so they're going to be well rested. And Tampa Bay is coming off playing at San Francisco, so they have that long trip out to the West Coast. Back home and then to Indianapolis. So should be a significant rest advantage for the Colts. And I think two teams moving in somewhat different directions. I don't think Indianapolis is going to be world beaters, but I think that this could be an okay team by the last third of the season. So only -1 in that game right now. One game to cover in week 13. Here we come back to the Rams. I mean, this by this point in the season, if you disagree with me about the trajectory of the Rams season, then these are not things that you would want to consider betting. I am putting a lot of emphasis on the Rams falling apart by the last third of the season, whether intentionally or unintentionally or a little bit of both. And so any team that is reasonably good should be able to dominate the Rams by the last third of the season. That is my premise. So if you disagree with that, I would steer clear of everything that I'm saying about these Rams lines by this time in the season. But Cleveland right now is -1 at the Rams. Again, they do have to travel out to LA, just like the previous week Seattle was going to LA. But Cleveland is a team that could remain in contention for a wild card. We'll see. I'm not 100% sold. Again, a lot rests on Deshaun Watson. But I do think, like most teams in the league, they will be categorically better than the Rams at this point. And to get it pretty close to a pick 'em, I mean, you could even play the money line here. The money line's -115. The chances of this Cleveland team beating that Rams team that I'm anticipating seems a lot better than -115 to me. All right. Last week is week 14, and I just have one game here again, and that is Pittsburgh -1.5 at home against the Patriots. The Patriots will be an interesting team this year. If that defense can be as good as it was last year, they still have Belichick. Maybe they're okay. I'm not totally writing them off. They just play in a really hard division. But this is a short week. Let me look up real quick here. Pittsburgh. Oh, yeah. So this is another Thursday night game. This goes back, man. So 2 of these for Pittsburgh. So it's a short week for both teams, but New England is the one that has to travel. And I know that they don't have to travel far, but it's still harder to go somewhere than it is to be at home. It's also, I think there's a decent chance Pittsburgh is going to need games like this in order to make the playoffs. I do think that there is at least a reasonable chance they can be in contention. Now they have to go through a gauntlet of a division. The same is true for Cleveland, which I talked about just before. I think these are two teams that if they were in different divisions, I'd be confident they were in the running for the playoffs. In the AFC North, I don't know for sure if that will be the case, but I think it's certainly possible. And if it's possible, then Pittsburgh probably needs to win games like this, which are winnable. They have New England and then they have Indianapolis, but then they have to play Cincinnati. They have to go to Seattle and to Baltimore. So they can't afford to lose in this streak of Arizona, New England, Indianapolis with those three really hard games to close out the season. If they're still in the running, they got to win. It's a short week against a New England team that I think the best that I think they can reasonably hope for is to have a strong defense that keeps them in low-scoring games. I don't think they can count on being great. So to get Pittsburgh just -1.5, that's basically telling you it's a pick 'em on a neutral field or even leaning slightly toward New England. I don't think that's the case. All right, those are the bets that I am considering on specific games from specific weeks. And if you do take any of those, remember to pay attention to the lines as we get closer to game time if you do want a middle or see how those move. And again, if you want to pick up on any more of this information or see the bets that I'm actually making on these games, you can subscribe to BigTastySports.substack.com. Hope everybody had a great long weekend and that you are even enjoying getting back into another week. Best to y'all, and I will talk to you later.